Charlie. Listen, Sheila, thank you for helping me out. I know Mrs. Wilson will be home around 11. Is this still normal? Just in case, I'll pay you in advance and add $20 on top. Thank you for the extra payment. Everything is fine, Mr. Wilson. I can stay as long as necessary. I'm already 18, and I'm on my own most of the time. And money won't hurt either, since the diner doesn't pay me much, and I still need to get a few hours of practice in order to get my stylist certificate. Should be finished by spring. Great, Sheila. Well, I'm off. Tell Mrs. Wilson I left something for her in the bedroom. See you. With these words, Charlie Wilson walked out of the house, slowly got into the car, and drove away. He looked back once, saying goodbye to the quiet street, illuminated by the soft light of the lanterns, to the shadows under the trees, to the houses in the neighborhood, and, most of all, to the cozy light of the windows of the house he had just left. He didn't know if he would see him like this again, if at all. He pulled into the hotel driveway, Gateway Inn, and went inside to register. He told the receptionist that he needed a room for at least a week, preferably with a refrigerator, microwave, and other essentials, such as an iron and ironing board. He held out his credit card and watched as she entered the room number into the electronic key. After finishing the checkout, he parked the car, took 2 suitcases, and headed to the elevator. Rising to the 3rd floor, he entered the room, unpacked his things, plugged in his laptop and phone to charge, then turned on the TV, turning the volume down to low. He sat on the bed, clasping his hands in front of him, and stared at the flickering images on the screen. He sat there for the next 2 hours, his eyes seeing nothing, his mind torturing him again and again. The only movement he made was when his cell phone rang, but it only rang briefly and went to voicemail. Charlie glanced at him briefly and then stared back at the screen. Over the next hour, the phone rang continuously, but Charlie Wilson no longer responded. Layla Wilson. At precisely 11 p.m., Layla Wilson pulled into her driveway and waited for the garage door to fully open. Her SUV barely fit into the doorway, the same one she bought with the bonus money Charlie earned last year. It was his idea to buy her a new car instead of the old Toyota, which was already 9 years old. She didn't want to take the money, but she hated that old wreck, and Charlie insisted. He always did this, trying to make life easier for her, as well as for their 4-year-old daughter, Christine. Before these thoughts took her too far, Layla drove all the way into the garage. And then she noticed that Charlie's car was not there. It was strange. His car was gone. He should have been home, looking after Christine while she was away. Again, she forced herself not to think about it. She turned off the engine and sat in the car, trying to calm her chaotic thoughts. What she did this evening needed to be hidden deep in a dark corner, mercilessly eradicated. She got out of the car and entered the house through the kitchen, where she found Sheila, the daughter of their neighbors, sitting at the table with a textbook. Layla nodded at her, walked past her into the living room, then into the office, and then returned to the kitchen. "Where is Mr. Wilson, Sheila?" she asked, taking off her coat, waiting for the girl to tell her where Charlie had gone. It wasn't like him to leave so late, especially considering his work as a salesman in Diamond Auto Parts. He often received calls in the evenings and even on weekends, but he never traveled to calls outside of business hours. He himself said that his clients work regular hours, unlike her, who had to work in the evenings. She pushed those thoughts away again when she heard Sheila explain that Charlie had called her a little before 7 and asked her to come over. He waited for her, then left for more than an hour, returned, went upstairs, and then came down with 2 suitcases. The girl said he mentioned that he needed to go away for a while. Layla listened in complete bewilderment, almost accusing the girl of lying, until she added that Charlie had left her a note in the bedroom. She paid Sheila, walked her through the back door, and watched until she entered her house, then closed and locked the door. After that, she headed upstairs to read the note. Her mind began to break through to what she had been trying to escape from all evening. Her fear, which she tried to drown out, began to seep through the protective barriers. Why now? This has been going on for 3 weeks now. Why exactly now did feelings of guilt and this dark fear awaken in her? Why exactly at that moment did Charlie act so strangely, scaring her? She was scaring herself, and she needed to stop. There must be a simple explanation. All she had to do was read Charlie's note. Before entering the bedroom, she stopped and looked into Christine's room. Her daughter's face was angelic, and this calmed her down a little. Leaving her daughter's room, she walked down the hallway to the master bedroom. She stopped in the doorway, looking around for a message. However, instead of him, she saw several scattered photographs on the bed. She walked over, picked one of them up, and held it up to look at it. She stared at the photo motionless for a few seconds before her legs went weak, and she collapsed silently to the floor, clutching the covers. She didn't notice the other photographs that slipped off the disturbed bedspread and fell to the floor around her. She didn't make a sound as she curled up into a ball and began silently crying. Her shoulders trembled, tears rolled down her cheeks, but there were no sounds. Lying face up on the floor was a photograph of her and Carson Jennings, her mentor and lover, embracing, their faces pressed together, his hands resting lewdly on her buttocks. Another photograph showed the two of them entering door number 107, apparently a hotel or motel room door. She knew that the other photographs no doubt depicted something similar. Hours later, or maybe just a few minutes, Leela stood up, walked into the closet she shared with her husband, and saw that his side was almost empty. He took most of his shirts and suits to work. She didn't need to look into the small bathroom to know that his things were gone too. She didn't need any more proof that he was gone and wouldn't come back, just as she had no doubt why he left. The photographs clearly showed her the reason, and now that he was gone, Leela had to admit that it wasn't a surprise to her. After all, she knew Charlie better than he knew himself. She sat down on the bed, just as Charlie Wilson had sat a few hours earlier, and continued to cry. One might wonder, why is she crying? Didn't she bring it to this herself? Didn't she imagine that Charlie might find out and react this way? Didn't she tell herself that what she was doing was terribly wrong? The answer was simple. Of course not. How can you cheat on your husband, with whom you lived for 7 years, the man you loved and adored, and ask yourself such questions? After all, if she started asking, she would have to look for answers, and the answers could not exist in her dirty world of denial. Despite the knowledge that she had ruined her life with Charlie Wilson, her husband, the man she loved, she reached for the phone to call him. She thought that if she could just talk to him, everything would just disappear, and he would return to her and Christine, and she could explain that it was just a mistake that could be forgotten. Holding on to this crazy thought, she dialed the number and waited. Almost answering her voicemail, she left a message. Charlie, where are you? Please call me as soon as possible. She hung up and dialed the number again, only to hear the answering machine again. She repeated this 4 or 5 times, leaving the same message each time before it finally dawned on her that he wasn't going to respond. Leela sat on the bed, looking at the photographs scattered around with unseeing eyes. She remained still and silent, eerily similar to Charlie sitting in the motel room miles away. Every now and then she would press the speed dial button associated with his number, put the phone to her ear, stare blankly at the wall, and then hang up. Charlie Wilson was a simple man. Average height, average weight, even-tempered character. Some said he was cute. Most thought he was not bad. His hair was brown, as were his eyes. At school, and then in college, his grades were average 4s and 3s. He graduated from a 4-year college in exactly 4 years, earning a fine arts degree like so many others. His family was also quite ordinary. My father graduated from high school, but not having money for college, got a job in the government service and became a postman, working in this field for almost 40 years. Over the years, he rose through the ranks and now ran a small post office in a small town. In reality, it was a good post office, very organized, but like most such establishments, unremarkable. Charlie's mother was a housewife, raised him and his sister, and kept the house clean and tidy. She was an attractive woman who still fit into the clothes she had kept for years and was loved by those around her. She was a typical housewife of her generation who believed that it was more important to devote herself to creating a comfortable home than to build a career outside it. Lunch was always at the same time and strictly on schedule. On Monday, meatloaf; on Tuesday. Well, you get the idea. One problem Charlie has always had is his shyness. She was unbearably strong and dictated his behavior throughout high school and college. He was lonely, but it didn't bother him because he was used to being alone. He had few friends, especially among girls. The thought of dating scared him to death. Instead, he retreated into a world of fantasy, finding refuge in books. He was lucky that he had a well-developed logical mind and iron discipline. It was this discipline that helped him cope with what for many teenagers was an abyss of uncertainty and anxiety. But not for Charlie. He was safe within himself. Layla Spiro was not an ordinary girl. She grew up in a good family where there was money, not fabulously rich, but quite wealthy. She did well at school, graduating among the best students. Of course, she was a cheerleader, and in her senior year she was team captain. She had her first sexual experience with Jake Monroe, captain of the football team, during her senior year, and lost him 2 weeks later. She was heartbroken, but more about the breakup with Jake than about the loss of her virginity. He was the most popular guy in school, and she needed to be with someone like him for her own vanity. In her anger, she behaved more licentiously for a while, but soon realized that she was only punishing herself. After that, she focused on studying and going to university to build a career in advertising. After graduating with honors, she was accepted into several prestigious universities and chose one that provided a good social life and was highly ranked in her field. In college, she joined the best sorority and dated the most popular guys, but never with anyone for long. Sex was rare and unremarkable. She devoted herself to her studies, attended parties, but firmly followed her goal. She took on the maximum course load and graduated from university in 3.5 years, several months ahead of her peers, giving her an advantage in her job search. Her degree was in communications, and she graduated in the top 10% of the class. Charlie graduated from college that same year and found a job selling auto parts thanks to one of his friends who recommended it to him. This choice seemed strange for such a shy and reserved person as Charlie, but the circumstances turned out that way. He wanted to become a teacher, but soon realized that the salary in this field left much to be desired, and the work turned out to be much more difficult than he imagined. Standing in front of a classroom full of students who were more intent on embarrassing him than learning anything was too much for him to bear. He was shy, but they were persistent and often got their way. Charlie ended up taking a job as a salesman and soon discovered that he had a real aptitude for it. He himself was most surprised when he realized that in sales he was not at all shy or an ordinary person. This pleased him, and he realized that he had found his calling. For the first 2 years, he worked on a salary basis and then decided to switch to commission. In the first year, he doubled his income. After graduating from college, Leela got a job at a leading advertising company in the city and immediately began to actively study the profession, improve in her craft, and make useful contacts. Being who she was, it wasn't difficult for her. She made friends with top artists, made contacts at parties and business meetings, left her business card everywhere she went, and 2 years and 3 months into her job, she became the youngest department head at her company. She accepted the position and made it her own, developing top-notch advertising campaigns. She was successful. By coincidence, one day there was a power failure in the city when Charlie arrived to meet with the buyer of a large chain of stores. A successful deal could make this a truly remarkable year for him. He had shown good results before, but this deal could be one of the biggest of his career. He was ready, full of optimism, and already planning how he would spend the annual bonus. At the same time, Leela was meeting with a client, hoping to secure a long-term contract with his company. This would be an important achievement for her. Leela would receive the status of leading designer and a good salary. In addition, this contract would bring her closer to a long-awaited promotion. Charlie headed towards the elevator just as Leela approached him. Being the gentleman he is, he made way for her to enter first. Then he entered himself, asked which floor she was going to, pressed the appropriate button, and the doors closed. Charlie stood silently, avoiding eye contact with the beautiful woman, as always happened to him in similar situations. As the elevator began to ascend, the power suddenly went out, leaving them stuck between floors in the dark. Soon the emergency lights turned on. Leela immediately panicked and began to choke. Charlie took it more calmly, but immediately realized that she was experiencing a panic attack, since he himself suffered a little from asthma. He forced himself to speak in a soft, soothing voice, patted her shoulders, began rubbing her hands and doing everything to help her calm down. Gradually, Leela began to breathe more regularly, then took a few deep breaths and felt better. While they waited for the power to return, Charlie and Leela talked and shared stories from their lives. Leela quickly felt comfortable in his company, and soon they were laughing and having fun. Charlie suddenly realized that for the first time in his life, he felt light and free next to a beautiful woman. They were sitting on the floor of the elevator when suddenly the lights turned on again and the cabin began to rise up. Charlie felt a slight melancholy. He didn't want this moment to end. When the doors opened, Leela walked out, but not before turning around, smiling brightly at Charlie and handing him her business card. "Call me," she said, and the doors closed. Charlie tucked the card into his shirt pocket, fully intending to call when it was appropriate. He went to his floor, thinking only about Leela and her smile. Charlie and Leela dated for the next 6 months, enjoying each other's company and sharing their dreams and hopes. Charlie began to get used to life together. He liked to visit places where he had hardly ever gone before. Leela opened the door to a world he had only read about before. For the first time, he was truly happy in a relationship. Their intimacy began cautiously, but gradually became more passionate when Charlie realized that Leela liked what he was doing. For the first time in his life, he fell in love and didn't want to be alone anymore. He tried several times to propose before finally making up his mind. Leela immediately agreed, and they began preparing for the wedding. The marriage turned out to be happy. Love life played an important role for both of them, and they explored all the ways to please each other. Leela was more experienced, but Charlie was a quick learner and enthusiastically absorbed everything she had to show him. He read books, suggested new ideas, and together they discovered new facets of pleasure. For Leela, Charlie was the ideal lover who always sought to please her. She, in turn, enjoyed the fact that she could satisfy him and hear his contented sighs. Knowing that he wanted her made her happy. Charlie felt the same way, and in this they were a perfect match. 2 years later, Christina was born to them, and both were delighted. It didn't matter to them whether it would be a boy or a girl, and they decided to keep the intrigue until birth. The pregnancy was easy, and Charlie showed himself to be a caring husband in everything. Leela tried to please him in bed until the very end, but in the last month her need for intimacy disappeared, and Charlie accepted this without question. Leela stayed home with Christina for the first year, but soon wanted to return to work once she found a good daycare. After this, life returned to normal. Weekdays were devoted to his career and evenings to his beloved daughter. The family spent weekends together. For Charlie, life was perfect, and Leela was happy. Financial issues were not an issue for the Wilson family. Charlie was a frugal person and tried to save money for Christina's future. He spent only on the essentials, but never denied the wishes of Leela and his daughter. Leela was successful and made good money in good years. Her income was $9,100,000 a year, and over the past 5 years, she had never earned less than $75,000. Charlie earned significantly less, about $65,000 to $65,000 a year, but always received bonuses ranging from $5,000 to $15,000. As soon as he received a bonus, he always spent it on something for Leela. He rarely bought anything for himself. His happiness lay in providing for his family. Around the time Christine turned 6, Leela was promised a promotion to department head if she continued to perform well for another year. To help her, she was placed under the direction of Carson Jennings, a high-ranking advertising executive at the company. Jennings was your typical ad guy, tall, with wavy brown hair, expressive blue eyes, and a handsome face that looked great in advertising. He was as skillful in conversation as he was attractive in appearance, and over the years he achieved great success. Leela looked forward to learning from Carson Jennings and often told her husband Charlie about him. He listened, made relevant comments, and encouraged her, advising her to learn everything she could. But at the same time, he wondered why she even needed such a mentor at this stage of her career. Leela secretly agreed with him, but was not ready to admit it, especially to Charlie. As a result, she completely stopped mentioning Carson in conversations with her husband, fearing that she would not contain her irritation and express how unfair it was. She didn't want to involve Charlie in this situation. Over the next few weeks, she watched as Carson did exactly the job he was assigned to do. He constantly monitored her work, gave advice, and at first simply approved of her decisions, and then admired her more and more. He spent almost all his free time with her, and she got used to his presence. His recommendations and tips helped her succeed, and she was happy with how everything turned out. He confidently led her to the long-awaited promotion, and she happily followed him. Nearly 2 months later, with Leela successfully securing 2 major contracts, Carson took the first step. It was subtle, a hand lingering too long on her back, a casual touch as she leaned over her drafting table, a hand on her shoulder that turned into a gentle movement. Leela decided it was an accident and ignored it. But soon it happened again, and this time she was sure that there was no smell of accident here. Frustrated and unsure of her actions, Leela nevertheless decided to remain silent and tried to simply forget about it. Nothing happened for several days, and she already thought it was a one-time situation. But a day later, he touched her again, and this time without any hint of accident. Leela tried to shrug it off, but Carson wouldn't allow himself to be pushed aside. Then she spoke to him, making it clear that she did not welcome his touch. He stepped back, glared at her, and then turned away. Leela relaxed, hoping that this would all end. It was that evening that Charlie started talking to her about Carson, and his words deeply affected her. But the consequences of this conversation made themselves felt much later. Charlie listened carefully to Leela, thought about everything she said about Carson, and analyzed the situation. He always did this. He never made decisions in a hurry, without having all the facts. He preferred to study the problem, weigh the pros and cons, and then draw conclusions. This was the case with Carson Jennings. Charlie decided to talk to his wife about his concerns at the first opportunity. But before he could say a word, Leela herself stopped mentioning Carson. She didn't talk about him much at all, and that also made Charlie think. Several weeks passed when Leela returned home visibly upset and worried. Charlie took care of Christine and helped with dinner, hoping that Leela would share her experiences with him. But she was silent. Charlie was disappointed, but decided that if it was really something serious, she would tell herself. However, the thought of Carson Jennings haunted him, and he decided that it was time to finally discuss with Leela everything that was bothering him. He put Christine to bed, bathed her, and read her a story for a long time, hoping that during this time Leela would calm down a little. If not, he will start this conversation himself. When he went downstairs, he found his wife at the kitchen table. She cleared away the dishes and everything was put in its place. She looked up when she saw him, but didn't say anything. Charlie sighed, poured himself some coffee, and sat down opposite him. "Layla, honey, we need to talk." He saw her expression immediately turn irritated. She clearly didn't want to discuss what was bothering her. But Charlie could not remain silent. "I have to tell you what should have been said before. This concerns Carson Jennings." At these words, Leela raised her head sharply, and her face turned pale. "What's wrong with Carson? What do you know about him?" she asked, almost panicking. Why such fear? Why this reaction? Now Charlie was sure that he was right. "I know that Carson has no reason to interfere with your work. You're doing great on your own. This means that he is there because he wants it, and if he wants to be around, then he has a goal, and most likely this goal is to seduce you." Charlie reached this conclusion based on his logical thinking and intuition. He was rarely wrong, and Leela knew it. She was not surprised that he had come to such a conclusion, but it was frightening that he had guessed so easily. I just want to warn you, if he hasn't made his move yet, he will do it very soon. You're smart enough to stand up to him, but I wanted to make sure you understood his intentions. And lastly, Leela, you know that every decision has consequences. Think about this before you decide anything. I won't say anything more except that I love you. You are my wife, and I trust you. With these words, Charlie lifted her from her seat, hugged her, and pressed her tightly to him. She buried her face in his shoulder and cried quietly. He realized that his words had come just in time. Now he knew. Carson was really making moves towards her, but Leela could handle it. Charlie took her hand and led her into their bedroom, where he made slow, passionate love to her until she begged him to take her faster and harder. He fulfilled her request, and soon they fell asleep in each other's arms. Monday, almost a week after Charlie talked to her, and she talked to Carson. That day, everything changed. She was preparing a presentation for a potential client when Carson Jennings walked into her office and closed the door behind him. He sat down in the chair opposite and silently looked at her while she finished her work. She knew he was here and used this time to pull herself together. His presence was unwelcome. She looked up, met his gaze, and nodded. "Hello, Carson. How can I help?" "Well, Leela, I have news. The company finally made me an offer to retire with full benefits and an excellent severance package. I will be able to take my wife on that cruise around the world that she has long dreamed of." Leela took this with conflicting feelings. On the one hand, she was glad that he was leaving and would no longer stand in her way. It was even more than she had hoped for, and so soon. On the other hand, he will no longer be able to help her advance her career. His recommendation would be very helpful. She wanted to get a promotion because it would have a significant impact on her income. He and Charlie needed money, although he didn't talk about it. She knew he would feel safer if their income was higher. Maybe then he would seriously think about a second child. She wanted it, but he was cautious. "Congratulations, Carson. I'm very happy for you. When are you leaving?" She didn't want to seem too impatient, but since he's leaving anyway, it's better to let it happen soon. "Next week. Everything is already arranged, but I would like to tell you something." He looked at her carefully, narrowing his eyes. "It might even work to your advantage. Do you want to hear my proposal?" His smile did not bode well, and Leela did not want to listen to it at all. But she had no choice. He was a very influential man in the company. "Of course, I'm listening. What exactly is my benefit?" "When I leave, the board of directors will want to know my opinion about your abilities. They will be interested in hearing my thoughts and will be more likely to follow my recommendations. I have a proposal for you." He made himself more comfortable in the chair, leaned forward, and put his hands on the edge of her table. It looked like a predator sizing up its prey before leaping. Leela felt uncomfortable, but could not say anything without seeming stupid. "I suggest you spend 2 hours with me in a motel room, where we will make love. I will not hurt you or do anything that you find disgusting, and definitely nothing that could hurt you. It will just be sex between two adults, nothing more. You love your husband, I love my wife, but sometimes I need more than she is willing to give. If you agree, I will recommend to the board of directors that you be promoted at the earliest opportunity, and I will also emphasize that your abilities deserve a serious increase." He looked pleased with himself at the look of shock on Leela's face. "But if you refuse, I will tell the council that, in my opinion, you have already reached a level that exceeds your abilities. And I recommend demoting you at the first opportunity." Now he leaned back in his chair, his smile widened and his eyes lit up. He waited, knowing that his position was very strong. Leela sat frozen in her chair, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Her mouth was slightly open in complete shock as her mind tried to process what she had heard. Carson stood up, leaned over her desk, and said very quietly, "Think about my proposal for a day. I'll talk to you again on Wednesday. Tomorrow I won't be there. Think carefully, dear. This is the only chance." Leela sat in her office for another hour, barely moving. Her mind processed Carson's proposal, and the surprising thing was that she actually began to consider it. When the first shock passed, she began to analyze the facts. She knew Carson would keep his threat. If she refuses, as she immediately wanted, he will carry out his plan and recommend her demotion. But if she does what he asks, the promotion will be guaranteed. She had a day to think things over. This decision cannot be made in a hurry, so she will give herself time. When Leela returned home that evening, Charlie immediately knew that something was bothering her. He intuitively felt that Carson was the cause of her concern, but he had already expressed his opinion, and it was valid. She knew his position, and there was no point in repeating it again. A good salesperson does not put pressure on the interlocutor until the right moment appears or there is a signal that it is possible to put pressure. Leela did not give such a signal. They had dinner together. Charlie cleared the table and washed the dishes today. It was his turn, and Leela played with Christina. Then the two of them carried her upstairs, put her in her crib, and stood next to her while the girl closed her eyes. Both were lost in their own thoughts, but unlike most problems, they could not discuss this one with each other. When they went downstairs, Charlie took Leela by the hand and led her to the sofa. They sat down and he hugged her. Leela leaned against him, finding comfort in his closeness. She pressed herself against him. His scent was familiar and pleasant, and gradually her body relaxed. Thoughts of Carson began to fade as she closed her eyes and let herself drift away. It was so calm in Charlie's arms that she could forget about everything, at least for one evening. When Leela dozed off, Charlie began making plans to find out what was bothering her. For the first time in their entire marriage, he was truly worried. But Charlie was a methodical man and intended to gather all the facts before making any decision. All that had to be done was to carefully monitor her behavior, and he knew her almost as well as himself. Any strange movement, any uncharacteristic thought or action will not escape his attention. Tuesday turned out to be one of the longest days of her life. There were no important projects to distract her, and her main employees were traveling on work assignments. Carson was away, as promised, so there was no pressure on her. She started thinking about his proposal again. The only reason she even considered it was because it wouldn't be the first time she cheated on her husband. The thought almost physically made her feel sick when she remembered it. This was 5 years ago. She was at a business lunch at the Biltmore Hotel restaurant with 3 businessmen, and 2 martinis during lunch gave her the courage to make a successful presentation to help sell the proposal. The men liked what they saw and promised to give a final answer the next day. They excused themselves and left to catch a plane to their headquarters. She was pleased with the meeting and was in no hurry to return to work. Sitting at the table, taking notes and wondering if she should have another glass, she suddenly heard a familiar voice. Layla? Layla Spiro? When she looked up, standing in front of her was Jake Monroe, her first love. She stood up, and he immediately pulled her into a tight hug. God, it's so good to see you again. It's been almost 10 years, right? Layla laughed. Almost. Now I'm Wilson. Layla Wilson. My husband is Charlie Wilson, and we have a little daughter. Her name is Christina. How are you, Jake? So many years have passed. Jake spun her around and then set her back on the floor. She invited him to sit down, and they ordered drinks while they chatted. It felt good to be with Jake again, and her mind, now freed from most inhibitions and unpleasant memories, went back to the time when Jake was the first man in her life. In her memory, now clouded by years and 3, maybe 4 martinis, it was great. She looked at his face as he spoke and remembered. Perhaps her inhibitions were weakened by the influence of alcohol. Perhaps distorted memories of her first time played a role, or perhaps the euphoria of a successful meeting and a promised contract was to blame, but the next moment she found herself in Jake's hotel room. Jake felt her breasts under her jacket and blouse. Memories of her first time with him created expectations in her that were completely inconsistent with what actually happened. She felt his hands, the same ones that awkwardly tried to unbutton her clothes. In her heated state, she decided to help him by taking off her jacket and loosening the clasps. There was a tense intimacy in the room, filled with anticipation and a heady sense of freedom. Jake suddenly grabbed her by the shoulders, spun her around, and gently but firmly lowered her onto the bed. She felt his confident presence nearby as he leaned closer, plunging them both into a whirlpool of emotions. Their breath mixed, and their touches became more and more daring. The very moment when it all started for the first time surfaced in her memory. Then it was unexpected, exciting, memorable. Memories painted a picture where everything was filled with delight and vivid sensations, although in reality everything turned out to be a little different. Jake moved confidently, completely focused on his emotions, not thinking about how Leela was feeling. She tried to find in this moment a reflection of the feelings that once filled her. Memories rolled in waves, mixing with reality, but there remained an elusive difference between them. Having finished, Jake leaned back contentedly and exhaled, touching her shoulder. There was a feeling of completeness in the air, but at the same time a slight, subtle feeling of emptiness. She remembered getting up, quickly grabbing her clothes, and walking into the bathroom. There she locked the door, cleaned herself up, then took out the necessary things from her purse and lingered in front of the mirror for a while, avoiding meeting her own gaze. Dressing quickly, she exhaled, collected her thoughts, and left. Passing Jake, who was lying on the bed with his hand over his eyes, she silently walked towards the door. "Hey," he called out in surprise, but she ignored him and left the room. She ran down the stairs without waiting for the elevator and quickly walked to her car. By that time, everything that had been drunk had long since evaporated. It burned up in this short burst of passion and lust. After sitting alone in the car in the parking lot, letting shame and humiliation wash over her, she finally drove back to work. Sitting at her desk, she replayed everything that had happened in her head over and over until she finally gave up and left work earlier than usual. Arriving home 2 hours earlier than usual, she went up to the bedroom. She took a shower, changed all her underwear, hid it at the bottom of the laundry basket, and then lay in bed and cried for an hour. She was literally sick from what she had done, and she climbed under the blanket, feeling the heat and heavy breathing. She felt so bad that she couldn't pick Christina up from school and called Charlie to do it. She spent the entire evening in bed, avoiding her husband and daughter, allowing shame to completely overwhelm her. She prayed again and again that the memories of what happened in that hotel room would disappear forever. Gradually, the nausea subsided, and she began to feel better, until Charlie came into the room, sat down next to him, and, with kindness in his voice, said that he would take care of everything. His concern brought back a wave of guilt, and she vomited in the bathroom. The next day, she stayed home until she felt she could look people in the eye again. Once she came to her senses and the worst of the guilt had passed, she analyzed her actions, classified them as a tragic mistake that she would never repeat, and promised herself that Charlie would never find out about her betrayal. Luckily, she was on birth control, so pregnancy was out of the question. After a prayer for forgiveness, a promise of fidelity, and a vow to become the best wife Charlie could ever dream of, she got dressed and went to pick up her daughter. As these memories flashed through her mind, Leela really felt bad. She jumped up from her desk, ran to the women's restroom, and got rid of the rest of her breakfast. The thought of what she did back then still hurt. She did everything she could to make amends to Charlie, and he never once showed that he suspected anything. The irony was that it was precisely this, the knowledge that she had escaped consequences last time, and the fear of what Carson would say if she refused him, that determined her decision. She will do what Carson asks, and like with Jake that time at the Biltmore, it will be one time and never again. This time, however, there was a plus. Carson promised to recommend her for promotion. The thought of telling Charlie how Carson was blackmailing her crossed her mind only once, but she quickly brushed it aside. She ignored the voice of her conscience, put Charlie's warning into the far corner of her memory, again promised herself that this would all end, and finally made her decision. She will do it. Driving home, stopping to pick up Christina, Leela was still processing the magnitude of what she had planned. She was either happy that the promotion was now in her pocket, and that the extra money would convince Charlie to get a sibling for Christina, or sad that she would have to betray Charlie to get it. But as before, she quickly pushed those thoughts away. Charlie will never know, which means it's not a problem. Now that the path had been chosen and her husband's betrayal had been set in motion, Leela saw only her own ambitions and goals. Charlie was left behind and was no longer a factor in her decisions. Leela did what she had to do and was sure that the promotion was hers. She felt relieved and happy that everything was over and that she could now become a loving wife to Charlie again. Oh, how the gods laugh when mortals make plans. At dinner that night, Charlie noticed almost immediately that Leela alternated between feigned amusement and unintentional sadness. He had been waiting for a long time for some sign that something was going to happen, and now it was as obvious to him as a flashing road sign. He didn't have concrete facts, but he knew he had to wait until something unusual appeared. He remained alert, but said nothing about his suspicions. Leela, immersed in her own thoughts, did not notice any changes in Charlie's behavior. Her intuition was dulled by her obsession with completing her plan, while Charlie, on the contrary, was more attentive due to his suspicions. Tuesday turned out to be quite a stormy evening. Leela wanted intimacy and wanted to be in charge in bed. Charlie usually liked this, but today he was sad he saw it as her desire to make amends or ask for forgiveness. As a man, he could not help but enjoy her attention and caresses, and he did so. Leela was insatiable, and Charlie had to work hard to match her pace. The night passed, both were satisfied, and Leela fell fast asleep in her husband's arms. Charlie also fell asleep, but later, and not so soundly, his thoughts were full of anxiety. The next afternoon, Leela called him and told him that she would return home at the usual time, but that evening she would have to leave again for a business dinner with clients. Charlie immediately realized that this was the event he had been waiting for. She usually met with clients immediately after work and had dinner with them after the meetings. She had never left alone before. He told her it was okay, that of course he would look after Christina and maybe they could do something special together. Leela promised to be home by 10 and asked him not to worry. Charlie thought for a moment and decided it was time to act, now that he had more details. His analytical mind calculated and weighed everything until he came up with a clear plan. He called a neighbor and asked her daughter Sheila if she would help him prepare a surprise for Leela. He explained that Leela was leaving for a business dinner and asked her to come as soon as he saw that Leela had left. This would give Charlie the opportunity to make several trips to prepare everything for the surprise. Sheila agreed, and Charlie, meanwhile, got ready to go to his wife's place of work, where, according to her, she was supposed to first make a short presentation and then go to dinner with clients. When he returned home that evening, Leela quickly prepared dinner for him and Christina, then hurried upstairs to get dressed for the meeting. She looked nervous, and Charlie didn't miss it, even though he pretended everything was business as usual. Around 7 in the evening, Leela came downstairs and kissed him and Christina before leaving. She hesitated for a second, as if she wanted to say something, but then walked out the door. As soon as Leela walked out into the garage, Charlie called Sheila and said that Leela was leaving. As her car pulled out of the garage, Sheila went in through the back door. Charlie gave Leela a 5-minute head start, after which he kissed Christina goodbye and followed. He was nervous but determined. When he arrived at her office, he saw her car in the parking lot, just like she said. However, it was only 5 minutes before she emerged from the building, followed by a tall, distinguished-looking, older man whom Charlie presumably identified as Carson Jennings. Leela said something to him, then got into her car, but did not drive away immediately, but as if she was waiting for something. Seconds later, the man drove past her in a sedan and pulled out of the parking lot, with Leela following behind him. Charlie watched the two cars drive away, and, as soon as the opportunity arose, he followed, keeping his distance. He followed them until the sedan turned into the parking lot of a small hotel next to the freeway. The car drove up to the office, and the man got out. Leila parked a little behind and waited. When the man left the office and got back into the car, the two of them drove to the back of the parking lot. Charlie followed them carefully, glad that it was already dark enough for Leila to see his car or figure out who was driving. He stopped, remaining in sight as they got out of their cars. Charlie picked up a small digital camera and stood there, waiting. His patience paid off as he snapped some nice shots of them getting intimate before they entered one of the rooms. He even managed to capture the moment when the door was open and the light from inside illuminated the room number. He waited until the door closed, then stayed another 15 minutes to make sure they didn't get out. Then he went home. Entering the house, he packed 2 suitcases with the necessary things and added a small travel bag with toiletries. Before he left, he printed out the best photos and left them on the bed for Layla. She will understand. He then took the things downstairs and gave final instructions to Sheila. After making sure she remembered everything, Charlie took the suitcases and went out to the car. It took him great effort to get to the door without bursting into tears. When he was finally able to pull himself together, he started the car and drove away. Layla made a deal with Charlie after talking to Carson on Wednesday morning. Carson was pleased that she had accepted his proposal and was looking forward to a pleasant evening with the young and beautiful woman. He promised that she would like it too, but she gave him no reason to hope. She simply nodded as he told her to pull up to the office at 7, so she could then follow him to the motel room he had pre-booked. They will spend a couple of hours in bed, and that will be the end of it. He will fulfill his promise, and she will get a promotion. Somehow she managed to make it to the end of the workday without breaking down. When the time came, she went home. She prepared dinner for Charlie and Christina so they could eat in peace while she was with Carson. She was nervous and afraid that Charlie would notice, but he seemed completely calm. She wondered again why she was doing this, and then reminded herself. For the promotion, for the benefits that she and Charlie would receive, for the sake of their future. And most importantly, Charlie will never know. The thought flashed through her head. This is what they mean when they say, once you cheat, you will always cheat. The fact that she had already gotten away with it once gave her the courage to do it again. If she hadn't cheated then, would she have been able to make up her mind now? Most likely not. When Charlie got home, she went upstairs, found some nice lingerie she had been saving for special occasions, and put it on. She chose a skirt that was short, but not too short, and a cute, but discreet blouse. I applied very little makeup. She looked at her reflection for a few seconds, and then went to the bathroom and changed into regular cotton panties. She didn't want Carson to think she was trying to impress him or was too sexy. Having finally dressed, she went downstairs. She wanted to turn around and stay home several times, but eventually forced herself to walk out the door. Charlie had been silent all evening, but she didn't dare say or do anything that might reveal her excitement. Charlie was too smart, too observant. No, she did everything right, she just left. She arrived at the office, went upstairs, and saw Carson already waiting for her. After confirming that he had indeed written a recommendation, she took a copy, read it, nodded with satisfaction, and put the document in her purse. They went downstairs and got into the cars. She waited until he left and followed him. As she drove the car, her stomach clenched in horror. She felt nauseous and was afraid it would ruin everything. She had to endure it. It was important for everyone. For Charlie, for Christina, for herself. It was nothing. Nothing. Carson is a pig. A real pig. But this is the pig on which her future depended. Carson drove for about 10 minutes until he turned into a small motel near the highway. She followed him, parked, and walked next to him to the room. Before opening the door, he asked if she was sure. God, she needs to gather her strength now. To completely dispel his doubts, she pressed herself close to him and stood on tiptoes, kissing him. He immediately grabbed her around the waist. His hands went down, squeezing her buttocks, and he greedily pressed her to him. She was disgusted by his eagerness and was relieved when he finally opened the door and pulled her inside, away from prying eyes. When the door slammed shut, she felt a little calmer. All that remained here was her shame and disgust. The next hour with Carson was both better and worse than she expected. He was an animal, completely unconcerned with her and her pleasure. He wanted her to be his sex slave, to do things for him that he obviously couldn't get at home. He demanded that she please, and she complied. Still dressed, she knelt in front of him and unbuttoned his trousers. She barely started, but he was already pulling her up, demanding what to do next. His movements were harsh and clumsy, causing her a strange combination of irritation and subtle superiority. She hoped that everything would end quickly, but everything that was happening only added to her internal rejection. She simply grabbed him with her hand and held him in place without even trying to do anything. His attempts to please her were so inept that she wondered if he had ever done this before. Charlie flashed through his mind the way he caressed her. But immediately, clenching her teeth, she drove away these thoughts. Not here. Not now. Not with this bastard. When she complied with his request, he moved closer, trying to please her, but his movements were clumsy, and she couldn't help but wonder if he'd done this before. For a moment, Charlie and the close moments they shared flashed through her mind, but she immediately pushed those thoughts away. Not now, not here, not with this person. Carson soon changed his position in an attempt to gain control of the situation. His actions were abrupt and clumsy, giving the impression that he was simply performing a mechanical action without thinking about her. This did not touch her at all, on the contrary. It caused a slight grin, which she immediately hid. Some time passed before he stopped, catching his breath. She glanced at her watch. More than an hour had passed, and she doubted he would want to repeat it. As he headed to the bathroom, she sat down, pulling the covers up, and waited patiently. As she suspected, he soon returned and told her she could go. He even dared to ask if she liked it. She didn't answer, quickly got dressed, and left the room. Instead of going straight home, she stopped at a small diner, ordered a cup of coffee, and tried to erase the entire evening from her memory. She felt bad, but not as bad as the first time 5 years ago. It was disgusting, but not as bad as she expected. Carson was awkward, and the whole experience felt like a joke. A bad joke, sure, but not so serious as to threaten her life with Charlie. He was better in every way than Carson could ever imagine. As she began to put it all out of her mind, the memory of that man who was on top surfaced again, and she realized that she could not escape the guilt so easily. She'll have to live with it, just like all those years ago. She drove home, still feeling slightly nauseous from what she had done, but gradually the feeling went away. It wasn't as scary as she imagined. Carson was a pig, just as she thought, but a pig without much stamina. She did it. It's all behind her. The promotion is in her pocket, and the benefits she and Charlie will receive will help push this evening out of her memory forever. It was harder than she expected, but now it's over. Everything is done. She wanted to call Charlie to tell him about the promotion, but she knew she couldn't. He would want to know what this had to do with dinner with clients, and she would have to lie. She hated lying to Charlie, and even more so in a case like this. He must never find out. Never, never, never. When she arrived at the house, she was almost happy again. She wanted to talk to Charlie, her love, her husband. They couldn't make love today. Too little time had passed since Carson. Even if she bathed for hours, it would be too soon to erase the memory of it. The only thing that could push away the memory of Carson was the feeling of Charlie inside her, where only he belonged. It would happen as soon as the opportunity presented itself, but if he wanted intimacy today, she could satisfy him. He liked it when she gave pleasure. However, she herself liked it too. Maybe she'll suggest it. Smiling, she pressed the button on the remote to open the garage door and waited. 10 minutes later, her world collapsed, and she was left alone. On Thursday morning, Charlie went to work. He was a dedicated employee and never missed a day of work. Even when he was sick and stayed at home, he called clients, made cold calls, if not for orders, then just to make sure they were satisfied. This Thursday was no exception, except for one thing. Charlie answered a few calls that his secretary left for him and then dialed his father, a now retired postman. He said he wanted to see his parents as soon as possible. Father said to come immediately. Charlie sorted out his affairs, took his jacket, and went to his parents. He settled into a soft, comfortable chair in their usual home and told them what had happened. He explained how he came to spy on his wife and what he saw. They listened carefully, asking only a few questions until he finished. The father then looked at the mother and then spoke. You must understand, Charles, that 1 out of every 2 marriages ends in divorce. This is a very common phenomenon and has already become the norm. You're even lucky that your marriage lasted this long before this happened. Layla is a very beautiful and talented woman. She is much taller than you and me. In such cases, divorce is the most logical solution. Leila will get custody of Christine, but she makes more money than you, so there won't be any child support. There will only be a payment for the child, and this is fair. Charlie listened to his father's words with a heavy heart. He was a very ordinary man, and his father was right. Divorce is the natural outcome of most marriages, and Charlie understood the numbers well. Numbers and averages were his life. Or at least they were before he met Leila. With Leila, he felt like he was part of something bigger. He began to feel more of the world around him. After all, if Charlie was average, then Leila was not. She was beautiful, stood out in the crowd, and attracted the gaze of men and women. Their gazes passed through Charlie towards Leila. That's what he told his mother. "It's true," answered the mother, "and that's good, since she was your wife." But apparently, Leela responded to these views, at least in one man's opinion, definitely. She looked at her son with sadness and continued, "If she answers them, 'My beautiful son,' then you have nothing to fall back on. You're definitely average, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it seems that the ordinary could not keep your wife." Charlie grasped at his last hope, a ray of light in the darkness of his mind. "Maybe I should talk to her. Should I let her explain? Maybe she has a reason that justifies her action, Mom. Should I listen to her before doing anything?" "Of course you should listen, but there is rarely a reason good enough to justify betrayal. She will try to explain her actions, but you have to be careful, son. Unless you or your child are in danger, there is no reason that can justify what you did. Money, prestige, promotion, or promises of future benefits are not excuses, but just excuses for doing something that shouldn't be done. Be very careful, my son. Be very careful." So Charlie drove back to his motel room, thinking about his parents' words. If he listens to them, his marriage will be over. His mind told him the same thing, but his heart desperately searched for a reason to forgive. He already missed his daughter, and that was the only thing he couldn't deny. He missed Layla too, and that was also undeniable. Together they were his life. Later that evening, Charlie made a decision. Whether it was right or wrong, in his mind he had no other choice. After all, he was who he was, and that couldn't be changed. He picked up the motel phone and dialed Layla's number. He waited for her to answer and, without preamble, said the prepared phrase, "I will return home tomorrow evening at the usual time. We'll have dinner, have our usual time with our daughter, put her to bed, and then you and I will talk. Good night, Layla." He hung up the phone without giving her a chance to say a word and leaned back on the bed. Everything was decided, and he knew that he would not be able to sleep until he saw it through. Layla finally fell asleep that night, still clutching the phone in her hand. When she woke up the next morning, the memory of the night before came flooding back, and, overcome with self-loathing, she threw the phone across the room. She barely flinched when it crashed against the wall. She stared at the spot where he fell until she noticed a small figure in the doorway. "Mommy, what is this noise?" I heard a loud noise and got scared. Christina stood there, holding a blanket in one hand and a doll in the other. Apparently, she had just woken up and was now looking to her mother for comfort. Layla looked at her watch, then stood up and walked over to her daughter. It struck her that it was almost 9 in the morning, and they both should have been dressed and gone long ago. But this morning was different from all the others. "Sorry, honey, Mom did something bad. Do you see what I did? My phone is broken, and I'll have to throw it away. When we break something on purpose, we lose it. Remember this, baby." She almost choked from the realization of the double meaning of what was said. Layla pulled herself together and took her daughter to her room to help her get dressed. Almost without thinking, she took Christina downstairs and prepared her breakfast. Kindergarten was not important today, and perhaps tomorrow too. Layla was not going to go to work today, and perhaps never again. At least not to where I worked yesterday. As Layla watched her daughter eat her cereal with milk, occasionally putting down her spoon to play with one of her dolls, she reflected on her job and what she had done to advance her career, to achieve what she had always known to be her desires. In the hours when she drifted in and out of sleep, thoughts of her time with Carson Jennings floated into her mind, and each time she associated them with betrayal. A betrayal of not only Charlie and Christina, but also her own self-respect, her professional principles, all the effort she had put into getting where she was before yesterday, before she went to that motel. Why did she think she had to give Carson her body to justify her promotion? Didn't she work? Didn't she do her job? Didn't she pay her dues? Why did he have to threaten to fire her to make her amenable to his blackmail? Clearly, he saw something in her that allowed him to take advantage of it, and the thought disgusted her. She sat and looked at what was most important in her life, Christina, her daughter. Why did it take all this for her to understand? This house, the child she bore with the only man she had ever loved, and that man himself were the only things that truly had the right to demand everything from her. They alone cost her life and self-respect, not work, not a promise of promotion. She may have ruined her life with Charlie, their marriage, but she could still turn her life around for the better before he took everything else from her. She couldn't and wasn't going to give them up without a fight. Her husband, her Christina, and her home were all she had left that really mattered. She knew what she had to do, and even though she knew it would require all her courage and lead to humiliation, she would do it. Layla made several calls in the office, where she sat with documents and PDA while Christina played. She wrote down a few names and addresses in a notepad, and then finally sat back in her chair with a feeling of satisfaction. Now she knew that she could handle it, even if Charlie did what she expected he filed for divorce. She needed to earn a living for herself and Christina, and now she had no doubt that she could do it. After making sure that Christina was safe and busy playing, Layla picked up the phone one last time and dialed the last number. The conversation was short, but brought her satisfaction. When she finally hung up, she smiled and stood up. "Well, little one, let's go to the park and have some fun. Want?" Christina laughed joyfully and jumped up from her seat. "Let's go, Mommy. I'm ready." Later, after a day full of joy for Christina and cleansing for Layla, she finally put her daughter to bed. Just a few minutes later, the phone rang. Layla grabbed it so as not to wake Christina and answered. She prayed it was Charlie, but she heard more than she could have hoped for. "I will return home tomorrow evening at the usual time. We'll have dinner, have our usual time with our daughter, put her to bed, and then you and I will talk. Good night, Layla." Like Charlie. According to him, by the tone and abrupt beginning and end of the conversation, Leela realized that he had made a decision. The fact that he didn't even give her time to respond or say anything was also his style. When Charlie decided on something, he moved forward without looking back. During their marriage, she always had a say before he made decisions, so she knew how he came to them. But not this time. She removed herself from the equation of their marriage. She knew that this was how Charlie would see her action. And he was right about it, even if he was wrong about the reason. Leela didn't sleep again that night, but at least she had something to look forward to. Charlie was supposed to come tomorrow, and that was the only thing she was worried about. She had her own things to do, but she would be ready when he arrived. Charlie spent the day as he always did, selling auto parts. It was not a glamorous or exciting job, but it was a necessary one, and Charlie did it as well, if not better, than anyone else. Today, he received several new clients through referrals and tried his best to convince them that he had the best products at the best prices. His boss checked in on him several times because his secretary said Charlie was different today, less talkative. She noticed that he was pale and looked a little ill, but knowing Charlie, he would never miss work. It bothered her, but every time the boss came in, Charlie was either on the phone with a customer, checking inventory in the warehouse, or submitting orders for shipment. The accounting department complained that he bore them with credit checks on new clients. Charlie worked all day, but left an hour earlier than usual. He seemed to be constantly glancing at his watch. At exactly 4 o'clock, he got up, closed the office door, and quickly walked towards the exit. He didn't talk to anyone, and no one tried to stop him. This was not typical for Charlie, who always tried to have a word with everyone at least once a day. He said that this way people would not forget about his existence. It was strange behavior, but no one cared. Everyone loved Charlie. This would surprise him because it never occurred to him that he could be loved simply for who he is. Charlie returned to his motel room, ordered a pizza, and calmly waited for delivery. He paid the courier, sat down at the table, and ate 3 pieces without much interest. His thoughts were working, and food was just a necessity, without distracting him in any way. I finished the last piece, carefully put the leftovers in the mini fridge, then brushed my teeth, washed and shaved before heading out for the evening. Charlie was thinking as he parked in front of his house at exactly 6 o'clock in the evening. Now he was not so confident in himself and knew that he needed a familiar routine. Dinner, playing with his daughter, putting her to bed. This was the order of things he was used to, and he craved it. But if he divorces Leela, this routine will disappear forever. Of course, he would be able to build a new one over time, but he was so sure that this order of things would be eternal. Charlie rarely swore, but as he approached the door, he cursed quietly to himself. He repeated this several times. He was still cursing when Leela opened the door. "Charlie, come in. Why did you knock? This is your home as well as mine. Your daughter is here. Why did you think you had to knock?" Charlie looked at Leela and was surprised that she hadn't changed. What did he expect? That she would have a scarlet letter tattooed on her forehead? That her betrayal will somehow distort her face? Of course not. Charlie wasn't used to being stupid and losing control of a situation, but that's exactly how he felt right now. "I don't know why I knocked. Everything is different now. Just different. Where is Christina? Is she at home?" Leela looked at her husband, and for the first time since she saw the photographs, her heart broke. Now she clearly saw how much she had hurt him, how she had turned his world upside down. She, like no one else, knew how carefully he controlled everything. She knew how he struggled with his shyness, and that it was she who helped him overcome it when she became his wife. It was one of the things she loved about him, what made him alive, real, different from the self-righteous snobs she grew up around. Charlie always needed her, and it touched her heart, made her love him even more. Now, watching him stand there with his shoulders slumped and his eyes downcast, she almost lost control. She abruptly walked away from this new, broken person she herself had created. She called Christina, and when the girl ran out and threw herself into her father's arms, Leela took advantage of the moment and ran into the small bathroom near the kitchen. She slammed the door, shuddered once, twice, and fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "God, what have I done? What did I do to him? How could I forget what this would mean for him? Was I really so blinded by ambition that I didn't even allow the thought that he would find out? Could I really be so selfish?" She waited for an answer, but, of course, did not hear it. She didn't need to hear him. She already knew the answers. Just like that day when I asked myself the same questions. But then she refused to think about them, knowing that if she did, she would not be able to do what she did. But then it was unacceptable for her, wasn't it? And now? Now it's too late. She stood up, washed her face with a damp towel, quickly checked herself in the mirror, carefully avoiding looking into her own eyes, as she had been doing lately, then opened the door and walked with a reserved step back into the kitchen to finish preparing dinner. Act like a normal mother and wife. Conduct yourself. Isn't that what she's been doing all this time? Charlie was in the living room, listening to his daughter excitedly talk about the new doll and how she would play with it and the others. He sat on the floor, carefully watching her every move, as if he was seeing her for the first time. He laughed with her, never at her. He was always careful about that and enjoyed her reaction. He focused entirely on Christina, trying not to notice Leela's absence. He noticed that she immediately left as soon as her daughter entered. He didn't know what that meant, but he didn't feel any more confident. Charlie was still watching Christina play when Leela came in to tell them both that dinner was ready. He helped Christina wash her hands and then followed her into the kitchen. Charlie placed his daughter in her booster seat, made sure it was securely secured, and then sat down in his usual seat, watching his daughter carefully and avoiding Leela's gaze. If he looked at her, he would be surprised to see her doing the same. Dinner was stressful for both Charlie and Leela, but Christina had no such problems. She talked incessantly, accepted her parents' help in cutting the meat, talked while they cut it for her, talked between bites, talked until the tension between Charlie and Leela began to ease. From time to time, they even made eye contact, albeit briefly, before looking away again. But by the time dinner was over, they were acting much the same as always. Charlie helped Christina out of her chair, took her back to wash her hands to clean up the remains of dinner, and then followed her into the living room. The girl turned on the TV and sat down to watch cartoons. Charlie returned to the kitchen to help with the dishes, only to find the table already cleared and Leela loading the dishwasher. He stood there for a second, and then turned and walked into his small office to check the papers he needed. He was putting them in his briefcase when Leela interrupted him. "Coffee is ready. I'll take it to the living room. This is fine." Charlie just nodded briefly and continued sorting through the documents. He didn't even realize that his actions meant something more to Leela. She took it as a sign that he was going to leave forever. For Charlie, it was just work. He needed these papers. To an outside observer, this looked like clear evidence that the connection between these two unfortunate people had completely broken down. Whose fault was it? But it would be wrong to talk about wine. There were consequences at work here, but were they final? They spent the rest of the evening as usual. For Charlie, it was relaxing and desirable routine gave him a sense of control. For Leela, this was tormenting because she was looking forward to the upcoming conversation. Charlie was not used to looking into the future. He preferred to deal with situations as they arose, generally preparing for all possibilities. Leela was completely different. She needed to be prepared for a specific event in advance. And this was just such an event. Finally, the time came, and together they carried their daughter upstairs to put her to bed. They played all evening, trying to ignore the tension and stress, and Christina enjoyed their attention, but was now very sleepy. Together they covered her with a blanket and stood next to her, watching as she made herself comfortable and closed her eyes. She was happy her parents were nearby and together. Last day was unlucky. Dad left, Mom was sad. But today everything was as it should be. Such is the world of a child, or should be like that. They went downstairs separately without saying a word to each other. Charlie went into the office, and Leela took the cups and coffee. She entered the office, placed the tray on the small table, and sat down next to Charlie. These two chairs and table were a gift from Leela's parents. When they first saw their small house, her mother was shocked by its size. She covered up her disappointment by saying that she had found an absolutely charming little table and chair set for them. Charlie found the episode funny, but he never asked what Leela thought about it. Maybe she was ashamed. He asked this question now, just to start a conversation. "I never asked you then, Leela, but how did you feel when your mother made that comment about the little set she bought? Did this bother you? Were you ashamed that our house was so small?" Leela was ready for almost anything, but this question took her by surprise. She was confused for a moment and then replied, "Of course not. I love this house, and I have never been ashamed of what we did. My mother knows this. Wouldn't you like something more familiar to you? I know it was probably always less than you wanted." The direction of the conversation puzzled Leela. She wanted to just run to Charlie and beg his forgiveness, but this conversation about the size of their house seemed crazy to her. "What are you doing, Charlie? Why don't you yell at me, accuse me of betraying you and Christina? Why are you playing this stupid game? Just want revenge? Cause me the same pain that I caused you." Charlie didn't answer. He simply looked down at his hands clasped between his knees. He struggled with himself, trying to find the right words. Finally, he stood up, clenching his hands so tightly that his knuckles were white with tension. He swallowed, looked straight at Leela, and his eyes were wide and filled with tears. "I want to go home. I want to be here with you and Christina. I just want to forget about everything and go home." Leela was so shocked by Charlie's words that she couldn't speak. She looked at him, mouth open and eyes wide, trying to make sure she heard correctly. Did he want to go home? To her and their child? Without accusations, without shouting, without reproaches. She stood up, slowly walked towards him, still frozen in painful tension, and hugged him tightly. She hugged him to her, for a moment forgetting about everything that happened between them, and said a prayer out loud. "Thank you, Lord. Thank you, thank you, thank you." Leela stepped back, released his clasped hands, took one of them, and brought it to her lips. "Come home, my love. Right now. Where you belong." And Charlie did as she asked. He returned home. But something was wrong. Charlie has changed, and Leela will soon realize that nothing will turn out the way she hoped. Nothing. Leela called into work the morning after Charlie returned and took a few days off. She had enough vacation days accumulated and didn't want anything to distract her from her duties as Charlie's wife. She was a little disappointed that Charlie had decided to sleep in the guest room last night, but then she thought it was just Charlie being his usual self. Today, she was going to give him a special evening and knew that he would not be able to resist her charms. Like any other man, he could never do it. She still had some work to do, so she signed up for her usual spa. She decided to do some makeup to look her best for Charlie. Leela was determined to do something to stop being a victim. Maybe it would be successful, maybe it wouldn't, but it was part of her plan. She spent the rest of the day doing household chores, cleaning, washing, ironing, all the things she usually hated. After all, she was first and foremost a wife and mother, and only then an advertising agent. She cooked the perfect dinner for the whole family, then picked Christina up from daycare as usual. She took a shower and changed clothes before Charlie arrived. She wanted to look especially attractive to him this evening. She owed him more than she could ever repay. He forgave her, and that was more than she could have hoped for. Charlie returned home at the usual time, calmly greeted Leela, kissed Christina, and went into the office to sort out his things. Then he went out, washed his hands, and went to play with his daughter. They talked about everyday things over dinner, then cleared the table and spent the evening with Christina before putting her to bed. Leela watched Charlie. He looked normal, acted as usual, seemed relaxed. This should have calmed her down, but instead she felt anxious. He was different, and she couldn't put her finger on it, but something had changed. After Christina fell asleep, Leela made coffee and took it into the living room where Charlie was sitting. He turned on the TV and watched one of the news channels. Leela sat down next to him on the sofa, put the tray of coffee on the table, hugged Charlie, and laid her head on his shoulder, closing her eyes. He should have snuggled back and asked her how her day was. But today he did neither. Leela waited, but Charlie didn't react. She straightened up, poured some coffee, trying to hide her embarrassment and disappointment, handed the cup to Charlie and took hers. Suddenly, a warm mug pleasantly warmed her hands, which had become cold. She felt a shiver run through her, although there was no draft in the room. Charlie remained calm and did not react in any way to her movement. Leela stared at him, seeing only his profile as he continued to watch TV. Throughout the evening, Charlie spoke only when answering her questions. Gradually, it began to dawn on her that what happened yesterday was not what she had imagined. Charlie did not return to his old life, did not remain the same as he was before. This Charlie was different, more distant, less loving, colder. She felt that it was from him that this icy aloofness emanated. Reflecting on everything that had happened, Leela suddenly realized her prayers were answered, but only half. Charlie came home, but old Charlie was gone, perhaps forever. She felt her eyes sting with tears and closed them. There was a lump in her throat, it was becoming difficult to breathe, and she wanted to scream to get rid of the fear, but she could do nothing but sit and let it consume her. The decision to return home was easy for Charlie. As always, he weighed his options and chose the one that was best for Charlie Wilson. He was shy, socially awkward, unless it was about selling auto parts, making deals, or if Leela was around. Leela was his rock in social situations. Charlie had never had a girlfriend before. There were dates, but they all ended in disaster. He stammered, became clumsy, and looked like a complete loser. But with Leela, it was different. With her, he was relaxed, confident, and spoke freely. Without her, he again became timid, shy, and easily embarrassed. Those who knew him put up with it and still loved the real Charlie, despite his awkwardness. In addition, Charlie was well aware of what other men thought when they looked at his wife. But when he saw Leela reject their advances and comments, he felt proud. The fact that such a woman chose him gave him confidence. It didn't get rid of all his shyness, but it did change him significantly. With Leela, he felt taller, smiled more often, talked more, and made friends. So, Charlie decided to return home primarily because he couldn't bear to be alone again. He didn't even want to think about entering the dating market again. He had friends, but they were mutual friends with Leela, not his own. Without her, he would again become withdrawn and avoid people. He didn't want to go back to that life. And he also loved Christina infinitely. Separation from her, even for a day or two, was unbearable for him. Therefore, returning home became a necessity. However, now he knew that he was mistaken about Leela. She didn't always choose him. Sometimes she chose others. All this destroyed his confidence. He thought that he satisfied her in bed, that their intimate life suited both of them. But now it turns out that this was just his assumption, and it was wrong. Therefore, he made a decision. He needs Leela so as not to turn into a closed person, but he will have to give up her body. He could no longer subject himself to the humiliation of knowing that he was not satisfying her. He had no intention of discussing his motives with Leela, so he simply moved into the guest room. It was tiny, but it allowed us to avoid intimacy. Before, when he didn't know that he was disappointing his wife, everything was fine. But now that the truth was revealed, it became too painful. Leela acted as usual, and Charlie knew he had done the right thing. She looked happy, although he didn't understand why. That suited her, and that was fine. In their relationship with Christina, everything remained the same, and this was the main thing. The evenings were the hardest for him. That's when Leela tried to play the role of a loving wife. But he could not answer her in kind. This is how the first week passed. A weekend with Leela lay ahead of him, and he was not looking forward to it with joy. But there was no choice. This was his new way of life, and he had to learn to live with it. 3 days after Charlie returned home, Leela realized something was wrong. Charlie didn't touch her. He did not share a bed with her, did not cuddle with her in the evenings as before, spoke only when she asked him direct questions, and seemed to avoid her in every possible way. Leela was slowly going crazy, waiting for him to accept her again. By the start of the weekend, she had come to a conclusion. She had to tell Charlie everything. What did she do and why? He needs to understand that she never stopped loving him, despite everything that happened. Others meant nothing to her. Even Jake didn't mean anything. It only took her one time to realize it, and she realized it almost immediately. After that, she never stumbles again. As for Carson Jennings, it was all about work, greed, and selfishness. Charlie needs to understand this and forgive her. She knew he didn't when he returned home, which meant she had to convince him that her actions couldn't ruin what was between them. Saturday became one of the longest days of her life. She didn't let Charlie know that she was going to talk to him that evening, but she spent the day turning over in her mind the words she was going to say. She must convince him that she repents and regrets what she did. She will be honest. She will tell him everything what she did and with whom. Charlie didn't know any of these men, which was good. He had nothing to fear. The day dragged on endlessly. Christina was bathed and put to bed. Charlie sat in the living room with a beer in one hand and the TV remote in the other. Leela put on a light summer dress with a deep neckline and dropped shoulders. It ended just above the knee and looked great. She knew this because Charlie had told her so more than once. Taking a deep breath, she entered the room and stood directly in front of him. Charlie, we need to talk. I see that although you returned home, you never forgave me. You don't touch me. You don't want to make love to me. You flinch when I approach you. I can't live like this, Charlie. I love you, but I can't stand this attitude. I need to tell you what I did so you can forgive me. You have to give me the chance to say it now. She watched as Charlie slowly put down the remote, took a long sip of his beer, and then set it down as well. He was silent for a few seconds, and then raised his eyes and looked at her. It's very simple, Layla. I came back because I was afraid to be alone. I don't want to live again the way I loved before you alone, immersed in work. With you next to me, I was able to find friends, communicate with people, and overcome my shyness. Before meeting you, this was impossible. Honestly, my life before you was terrible, and I don't think I can live like that again. I need you and our daughter to feel complete. I know it's selfish, but it's my truth." Leela smiled, hearing his words. He needed her. It was so important. She wanted to interrupt him, to stop him, and make him listen to her, but she was not ready for what he said next. "As for what you wanted to tell me, no, I shouldn't listen to it, and I don't want to know. I already know the main thing: you chose someone else, and it was your choice. I always believed that you needed one, but now I understand that I was wrong. I thought when we went out together and other men looked at you, wanting you, you still only wanted me. I was proud of it, and in his pride he was stupid. Now that I know the truth, all I can do is come to terms with it." Leela wanted to say something, but he continued. "I came home because I don't want to be alone, but now I understand that I have to turn a blind eye to everything you do with other men. I hate it, but it was your choice. So, Leela, you have to understand why I don't want to know the details." Leela was so shocked by his words that she could not utter a word. As she stood there, stunned, Charlie stood up, left the room, and headed upstairs to the guest bedroom. She heard the door close and the lock click. Leela was still sitting there an hour later when she made her decision. She knew what she had to do. Charlie closed the door behind him and turned the lock. It was more of a symbolic gesture. The castle could not keep anyone out, but for him it was a sign that he was choosing to be alone. Now he needed this to suppress the pain that rose from the depths of his soul along with his confession. He hid it so carefully. He remained calm in front of Leela and Christina. Charlie is reliable, strong, a coward. Other men would call him a weakling, and they would be right. Now that Leela knew why he came back, Charlie expected things to change. It was hard to accept, but bearable. She will maintain the illusion that they are together, and he can remain part of society. Their friends will never know the truth, and he will be able to communicate with them calmly. But Leela will know that he knows his place, that she is free to do as she wants, and he will not say anything. Charlie is a weak cuckold, but it's better than being alone again. He repeated this to himself over and over again, hoping that one day he would believe it. Charlie lay down on the bed, closed his eyes, and forced himself not to cry. He was still a man, even if humiliation now awaited him. He must learn to live with it. His words to Leela weren't just words, he had to make them true, at any cost. Sunday went the same way as Saturday. Charlie tried to spend as much time as possible with Christina, sometimes with Leela, but never alone. He didn't want to be alone. He was almost manically active with his daughter, but a little more reserved with Leela. Christina enjoyed the attention and felt important. She was too young to understand the tension between her parents. She just knew that today they belonged entirely to her. The evening dragged on, and for some reason she was allowed to go to bed later than usual. Her dad kept her busy so her mom wouldn't interfere until the girl was too sleepy to play anymore. Then he carried her to bed, stayed next to her, reading a fairy tale, and soon she fell asleep. Charlie stayed upstairs after putting Christina to bed by reading her a story. He showered, got his clothes ready for the next day, and then went to the guest room to read before bed. He left the door open, not expecting Leila to get up in less than an hour. She no longer asked him to return to their shared bedroom, so Charlie no longer felt the need to lock the door. He read a book found in the office, but later he remembered almost nothing from it. Looking at his watch, he decided it wasn't too early to try to sleep. He turned off the light and covered his eyes with his hand. Sleep came slowly. As for Layla, she stayed downstairs as long as possible, knowing that Charlie would not accept her into his bed that evening, just like last week. But at least she could go to bed that night knowing she had a plan to save his marriage, regardless of Charlie's doubts. His beliefs were based on lies. A lie he believed, but a lie nonetheless. Layla was determined to destroy this lie in the next few days. She will break it or suffer a crushing defeat. In any case, she won't be in more pain than she is now. On Monday morning, Charlie left for work very early. Since he returned home, He has been coming to work earlier than before. This allowed him to avoid meeting and talking with Layla, and she understood this. But today it didn't bother her at all. She had things to do and plans, and the need to get Christina ready for kindergarten without telling Charlie what she would do. Having taken Christina to kindergarten and agreed on a time to pick her up, Layla headed to the office. When she reached her office, she closed the door, picked up the phone, and called to confirm an appointment with Philip Bassett, the company's president and the boss of her boss, Angela Stutson. She indicated the reason as personal in order to bypass her immediate superior. She was given an appointment at 10 in the morning. After hanging up the phone, she began to analyze her work tasks. While Layla put her plan into action, Charlie went about what he did every day. He called clients, closed deals, arranged deliveries, and earned money to support his family. This responsibility remained paramount for him, the responsibility to provide for his family, even if it was no longer intact. This hurt him, but did not change his understanding of his role as a father. His role as a husband also did not depend on the actions of his wife. He knew that she earned more than him, and her financial well-being did not depend on his income. Perhaps her salary contributed more to the well-being of their daughter, but he still continued to earn and contribute. The people around Charlie couldn't help but notice his behavior. He's always been a little reserved, but this week and last week, he's become even more withdrawn and gloomy. This was a significant change, so after a few worried whispers among his colleagues, his only close friend, Walt Smith, decided to find out what was wrong. He waited until it was almost lunchtime, sat down in Charlie's office, and waited for him to finish the phone call. "Okay, Charlie, you and I are going to lunch, and we will have a liquid lunch, so let's go." Charlie didn't really want the company and tried to refuse, but Walt wasn't going to back down. Charlie was many things, but he was not known for his firmness in the face of persistent persuasion. He was too polite to continue to refuse, so he agreed. Walt took them to a small bar and grill he frequented and chose a table in the corner. After placing his order, a grilled bolognese and onion sandwich plus a bottle of Rolling Rock, Walt got down to business. "So, my friend, lay it out. What's the problem? Let's do it right away so I don't waste time on unnecessary things. You know I'll get you anyway, so lay it out and let me dine in peace." Charlie wanted to refuse, but something inside desperately wanted to share this heavy burden. Although he considered himself weak, sometimes even soft and submissive, in reality he was a very strong person. Many with his character would have long ago withdrawn into themselves and escaped reality, but he found a goal in life and achieved success. What happened to him could have pushed someone to act rashly, but Charlie kept everything to himself, trying not to hurt others. He thought he had done it, but the load remained too heavy. He started telling Walt about his problems, and 3 beers, and almost 2 hours later, he told him everything. All your anxieties, fears, conviction that your wife is cheating, your need for her support. Walt listened to everything and admired his friend's resilience. He was amazed at how Charlie handled the situation. Other men in his place would have already lost control, filed for divorce, thrown their unfaithful wife out onto the street, or done something else in the same spirit. Walt himself would have done exactly that. But he knew Charlie, and the solution he chose was entirely consistent with his character. Charlie weighed his options, chose the only one he could bear, and returned to the house of the woman who had nearly destroyed it. Few people could understand Charlie, and most would consider him a pathetic loser, a weakling. But they were wrong. In their pride, they could not see a person much stronger than themselves. Walt was one of the few who understood. That's why he was Charlie's friend, and that's why Charlie trusted him. "Okay, buddy, I can't tell you how much I respect your decision. You did the only right thing for yourself, and it took great courage. More than I have. I hope you have the strength to keep going, but you need to find a way to find some peace of mind." Walt looked at Charlie, considering the offer. He didn't know how he would perceive him, but he decided to take a risk. "Charlie, have you ever thought about a girl for the night? About paying a woman too? You know, if you're going to avoid your wife, you need a way to relieve the tension. Your right hand won't last long." Charlie listened, but didn't pay much attention. He had already drunk 4 or 5 bottles of beer, and usually only allowed himself one at most. But talking to Walt helped. It was a relief to talk it out. But Layla really betrayed him, didn't she? This was precisely betrayal. Charlie felt like a total fool all these years. How could he believe that such a beautiful woman like Layla could love such an insignificant person like him? He nodded thoughtfully, agreeing with his sudden insight. Walt took this as agreement with his proposal, looked around the bar, and noticed a prostitute in the corner. He beckoned her with his finger. She smiled, stood up, and walked towards them, swaying on her 4-inch heels. Charlie was still lost in thought while Walt was sorting things out. After withdrawing money from the ATM across the street, he slipped the girl the $150 he had intended to take from Charlie in the morning and stood up to give her a seat next to his friend. "Look, Charlie, I have to go, but this is Sky, and she wanted to meet you." "Sky, this is Charlie. See you tomorrow, buddy." Charlie muttered something in response, not even realizing what had happened until he felt a light touch. A warm hand slid down his leg, making him flinch in surprise. He lowered his gaze and then met the eyes of the girl, whose smile was full of hidden mischief. The girl kissed him on the lips, and then, taking his hand, stood up and pulled him along with her. Charlie rose from his chair and followed, not having the slightest idea what else to do. Now his only motivation was the presence of a woman. Alcohol dulled his habitual shyness. They walked out the door and around the building, Charlie still following her. The girl looked around, headed to a darkened area of the parking lot where the light could not reach, and led him there. She pressed Charlie's back against the wall of the building and crouched in front of him. She unzipped it and stuck her hand inside. "No shit, it's just a monster. Charlie, what's wrong with you? I don't understand how some woman could cheat on you with such a machine." "Crap." Charlie leaned back, thinking there was nothing wrong with it. He probably knows this girl, and she clearly gives him pleasure. And this is, without a doubt, good. This is what he wanted. Leela always gave him pleasure, too. Charlie took a deep breath, trying to get rid of the flooding memories, but the sensations that he experienced at that moment completely captured him. He leaned his head back, allowing himself to relax as memories of the past mixed with the present. For a moment, it was as if he had returned to those days when everything was different, when he was happy and carefree. However, reality quickly brought him back to the present. The girl in front of him smiled with satisfaction and straightened her hair, watching his reaction. "Well, handsome," she grinned, looking at him. "I think you were satisfied. Although, judging by your appearance, you are ready for the second round." She leaned closer, her voice sounding playful, but there was a hint of business in it. Charlie just nodded silently, still lost in his thoughts. The girl took this as a sign of agreement and, without wasting time, suggested a more daring option for continuing their evening. She leaned against the wall, giving him a searching look. "Here I have a proposal." Her voice sounded as if she was discussing a regular deal. "If you want, we can stay here and not spend money on a room. Everything will be simple and fast." Charlie hesitated for a while, but the feeling of freedom and long-forgotten lightness took over. He took a step forward, allowing himself to be completely absorbed in this moment, without thinking about tomorrow. Time passed slowly, mixing reality with memories, until finally they both froze, feeling their breathing gradually even out. The girl smiled and straightened up, quickly putting herself in order. "You know, it was unexpectedly nice," she said, straightening her clothes. "I didn't even think that this could be so. Honestly, I liked it." She gave Charlie an appraising look and, grinning, added, "If you suddenly want to repeat it, stop by. Next time, a bonus from me." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the middle of the night, contemplating the events of the last few minutes. Charlie ran his hand over his face, took a deep breath, and walked away, still not understanding what exactly he was feeling at that moment. Charlie, realizing what he had just done, suddenly realized that he was not so useless after all. Feeling a rising wave of confidence, he walked around the building, got into his car, and returned to work with a smile. As he passed Walt's desk, He raised his fist in victory and headed to his office to get busy making calls, contacts, and selling parts. This is exactly what he did, and deep in my chest a new feeling grew: confidence. Self-confidence. At 10 o'clock sharp, Leela walked down the corridor to Philip Bassett's office and introduced herself to his secretary, June. In her hands was a letter from Carson Jennings, which she was going to show him. She waited patiently until June invited her in with a smile and a nod. Leela walked in, stood there until the door closed behind her, and then waited for Mr. Bassett to tell her to sit down. She took a chair, sitting with a straight back and tightly clasped legs. She was more nervous than ever, but she was sure she had to do it. She also knew that it would be very humiliating, but she had no choice. Well, Leela, while I always enjoy talking to you, I have to ask, why this sudden request for a meeting? Did something happen? Your work is top-notch as always, and I hope you have no problems with Angela. Philip Bassett showed no signs of suspecting anything unusual, but he was clearly interested. Leela was a valuable employee, and he knew her abilities and importance to the company well. He was reminded of this just a couple of days ago. No, sir, I'm fine with Angela, but something really happened. I want you to read this letter and tell me if you have seen it before. She handed him a letter from Carson Jennings and waited patiently for him to read it. She watched his face carefully and was not surprised to see an expression of bewilderment appear on it. This is exactly what she expected. That's why she was so angry with herself. Sorry, Leela, but no, I have never seen this letter before. To be honest, it surprises me a little. What do you expect me to say or do? In fact, I don't expect anything from the letter itself. But I want to tell you how I got it and what I had to do to get it. I want you to listen to me carefully, and please let me tell it the way I see fit. This is very humiliating for me, but I have to do it. This is important to me. Of course, Leela. Speak up, I'm listening. You look very upset. Did something happen? Did something happen? Please tell me, and I promise to listen. Now that the moment of truth had arrived, her face burned with shame. She knew that what she was about to say was humiliating. There was too much at stake in this meeting, and she hoped for the best. Leela carefully folded the letter and put it in her purse before speaking. Over the next 15 minutes, in a firm voice, Leela told Philip Bassett everything from the moment she and Carson started working together to the evening she spent in his motel room. She gave him a copy of the check with Carson's signature that she was able to obtain from the motel manager, and time-stamped photographs that her husband took of her leaving the motel with Carson. She didn't hesitate when she told him what Carson demanded of her, and she made it clear that she did everything he wanted from her. She explained her motives and did not deny anything. When she finished, her chest was heaving, her lips were trembling with humiliation, and her head was bowed, looking at the floor. Bassett was silent for several minutes, then cleared his throat, picked up the phone, and asked his secretary to call Judith Blessing, Vice President of Human Resources, and invite her to his office immediately. While they waited, he asked Leela a few questions and seemed very concerned about her admission that her marriage was in jeopardy. He answered the phone, nodded when told that Judith was on her way, and then asked the secretary to bring coffee and not connect him to anyone. When everyone was assembled, the coffee was poured, and Leela was holding the cup with both hands, as if trying to warm them. He began to speak, turning to Judith. We have Leela's confession that Carson Jennings blackmailed her, demanding sexual favors in exchange for the promise of a positive recommendation. She admitted that she agreed to this because he stated that if she refused, she would face a negative recommendation and disciplinary action in the form of demotion. I read Carson's letter, saw photos of the meeting, and Leela confirmed that her marriage was over because her husband suspected Carson from the very beginning. I have to say, Judith, I believe Leela's story, especially after the conversation I had with Carson yesterday. He paused, giving Judith time to process what he had said, and motioned for Leela to hand over the letter. She took it out again and handed it to him. Bassett unfolded the letter, skimmed it again, and then handed it to Judith. She read it carefully, and her face contorted in disgust. When she finished, she silently returned the letter to Philip. Yesterday Carson told me about Lila, And at first I took his words literally. But the more he talked, the more it worried me. There's no need to go into detail, but now that I've heard Leela's version, everything starts to fall into place. We have important decisions to make, Judith. Layla, please leave us for a while. Come back in an hour. And don't tell anyone anything. Philip stood up, walked around the table, took Leela by the hand, and walked her to the door. Trust me, Leela. I understand how important this is, and you won't regret telling me about it. He watched her walk away, looking like she had just lost her best friend. This was probably the case, and he was saddened to realize that one of his employees was to blame for this. As soon as Leela returns, let me know immediately. Thank you, June. That day, Charlie stayed late at work, something he almost never did. After returning to the office, he worked diligently for another 4 hours, finishing the last call at 6:30, an hour later than usual. He was surprised to find himself alone in the office. Having collected his things, he locked the office and went home. All the way he tried not to think about what happened to the girl of easy virtue during the day. He knew that such girls do their work for the money, making the client feel like a great lover so that he will come back again. And Charlie well understood the value of repeat business. It was they who made him successful. However, he couldn't help but think that that girl really felt pleasure. He knew this for sure. And this surprised her herself. He saw it in her face. She said he should be proud of himself, and to his surprise, he really was. When he arrived at the house, he was surprised to find that Leela was not there yet. Sheila and Christina were playing in the living room. Dinner was already finished, judging by the cardboard boxes. It was an order from the restaurant. He came in and asked for Sheila when Leela called her to ask her to babysit. She replied that at 4:45 in order to have time to pick up Christina from kindergarten. This surprised Charlie because he couldn't remember the last time Leela didn't pick up her daughter herself. She always emphasized that this was her responsibility and she would not miss it for the sake of work. He released Sheila and put away the cardboard boxes in the kitchen while Christina played with the dolls on the floor. Charlie was concerned. The disruption to his routine made him wonder what could be so important to Layla that she would allow someone else to take her daughter. He had thoughts, and these thoughts made him feel sick. She may have started looking for other men to fill the void in their relationship. After all, he himself had told her that he understood her need for more than he could give. Perhaps now she felt that she could do this with his tacit consent. Charlie took Christina into the living room and let her play while he meditated. It was almost time to put her to bed when he heard a car pull up and the garage open. He looked at his watch. It was already 7:30, almost bedtime for Christina. He decided to give her the opportunity to see her mother before going to bed. Christina was not to blame for anything, and if he decided to punish her mother in this way, it would mean punishing her herself. Charlie couldn't do that. So, no matter what Layla was doing or with whom, Charlie decided to wait and let Christina spend some time with her mother. She pulled into the garage and closed the door behind her. She sat motionless for a few seconds, then took a deep breath and opened the car door. Slowly, she walked up the 3 steps to the door, leading from the garage to the kitchen. Through the glass window, she saw that the kitchen was clean and tidy. Charlie. It was he who put things in order. She pushed the door open, threw her briefcase on the table, and took off her jacket. She threw it towards the chair, but missed. The jacket fell to the floor, but she didn't even pay attention to it. Layla walked slowly through the kitchen into the hallway, hearing her daughter chatting with her doll. Charlie was undoubtedly nearby, carefully watching her every remark and movement. She walked into the living room, saw the joyful expression on her daughter's face, and leaned over, opening her arms to hug her. The small body rushed towards her, and Layla felt a wave of love and peace. She hugged her daughter tightly to her, and this warmth, this love revived her a little. She missed this so much right now. It was all she had left now that Charlie had turned his back on her. She held Christina so tightly that she eventually squirmed, trying to free herself. Layla set her daughter down and greeted Charlie. He turned his head and looked at her. This look made Layla's legs give way. She grabbed the back of the chair to steady herself as the shock of what she saw settled in her mind. What is he thinking now? Suddenly it dawned on her. She hadn't bothered to tell Charlie where she had been all day. She knew what he must have been thinking. She returned to the kitchen to compose herself. How could she not tell him? She spent the whole day with Judith and Philip, and it was not until about 7 in the evening that their meeting ended. Layla stayed until the end because she achieved what she wanted, and this was necessary for her plan. But Charlie knew nothing about it, and his mind probably painted a less than rosy picture. What should she do now? She had no choice but to continue on her chosen path. Charlie waited until Layla left the room. He stood up, feeling older than his years, leaned over to take Christina's hand, and led her upstairs. She asked him to carry her, and he did, enjoying the way her arms and legs wrapped around him. Her love was pure and unconditional. He answered her in the same way. They talked for a while he helped her put on her pajamas, wash her face, and brush her teeth. A few strokes of the brush through her soft brown hair, and she was ready. Charlie watched Christina climb into bed, waited for her to say a prayer. When she finished, he turned off the light, leaving the door slightly open to allow a faint light to enter the room, and slowly went downstairs. Layla sat in the kitchen, clutching a cup of coffee in her hands, and sadness was frozen on her face. Charlie felt the need to talk to her, to ask questions. He was afraid of the answers, but as always, he could not resist asking. He was most concerned about his daughter's well-being. He wasn't going to go to bed with unresolved doubts, and he didn't want to punish himself for it. He took a beer out of the refrigerator and sat down opposite Layla. "Can I ask where you were and with whom? You never forgot about Christina or entrusted her to someone else. And I'm guessing you weren't with one of our mutual friends. I hope you remembered this." Layla felt as if she had been hit. Charlie spoke in a soft voice, but there was clearly an accusation in it, and contempt was visible on his face. He had made an assumption, and now he asked her to confirm it. The first flash of anger quickly past the mind suggested that the question, albeit rude, was fair. After all, it was her actions that made him think that way. What answer did she expect? After everything she had done, how could she break the routine and say nothing to him and hope that he would just shrug and remain silent? "I spent the whole day with Mr. Bassett and Judith Blessing. Philip Bassett is our company president, and Judith is our vice president of human resources, reporting to Philip. And why, may I ask, were you with them? What was so important that you couldn't take Christina? You've never done this before." "I needed to discuss something with them, and I sought certain decisions from them. It was too important to leave without finishing the job. I arranged for Christina to be taken away, but I didn't warn you, and for that I apologize. Understand. Have you seen anyone else today besides your colleagues?" The question sounded with a clear hint. "No, Charlie, no one, and I won't see you again. Never. Whatever happened between us will never happen again." Charlie's voice shook with anger. "You've already made promises you couldn't keep, Layla. So no need to give me new ones. I'm sure you're sincere now, but you don't know how to keep your word." These words hit Layla, causing tears to burst out. She dropped her head into her hands and gave vent to sobs. Charlie sat silently and listened to her cry. He was hurt, but he couldn't help but tell the truth. Layla raised her head, wiped her eyes, and straightened up. "I deserve it, but I didn't expect to hear that from you, Charlie." Then she took an envelope from her briefcase and placed it in front of him. "That's why I was delayed. This is for you. You chose another man over me, and it was your choice. I always believed that I was the only one you wanted, but now I see that I was wrong. I thought that when we went out together and other men looked at you, wanting you, you only wanted me. I was proud of this, and in my pride I was stupid. Now that I know the truth, all I can do is accept it." Those were your words, Charlie, and they were wrong. They were so wrong that I realized I needed to do something to prove to you how wrong you were. If I can do nothing else, at least this. This is exactly what I did today, and this is what I wanted to convey to you. She slid the envelope across the table towards Charlie. He took it, opened the flap, and pulled out 2 sheets of paper. The first one was folded and looked like company letterhead. When he unfolded it, he saw a printed receipt with a statement section on top. He read carefully. By accepting this payment, Mrs. Porter Wilson will not bring any claims against the company or any of its employees. No other conditions, express or unexpressed, are connected with this payment. Cashing this check constitutes confirmation of your acceptance of these terms. Charlie looked at the check and saw that it was in his name for $250,000. It was a shock to see such a sum on one check. Charlie was a good salesman, but even the largest deposits on his deals rarely reached 5 figures. And here's 6. He put the check back on the table and took the second sheet. It was a simple letter of resignation, signed by Leela and dated today. Charlie, being a man who loves order, read it twice, looking for a catch. But the document was simple, and at the bottom there was a second signature, Angela Statson, Leela's boss. Charlie looked at Leela and asked one single question. "Explain to me what I see now." She took a deep breath and began to speak. "You said I did this because I didn't think you were enough, that I needed something that you couldn't give me. This is so far from the truth that I couldn't leave it as it was. I needed to find a way to prove you wrong. I didn't go to that motel because I wanted something that you couldn't give me. There was another reason, and I am ashamed of it. This check is payment for Carson Jennings harassing me. But before you say anything, let me explain. I wanted to get a promotion. You know which one I'm talking about. We discussed this when I was trying to explain to you why Carson Jennings was working with me. Then you asked, if I'm so good at my job, why do I need him? You were right, he wasn't needed. But I convinced myself that this was not the case, and he really helped me. I was sure that the promotion was mine, and I was already making plans for how we would spend the extra money. You have to understand, Charlie, I was thinking about this money and how it might make you reconsider your decision about having a second child. I wanted it so much and didn't think well at the time, but I was sure that I would get a promotion. It mattered to you. I was so happy until Carson proposed to me. Everything turned out to be so simple for him because he knew how much I wanted this position. He said she was mine if I spent 2 hours with him in his room having sex. If not, he will give me a bad reference and I will be demoted. Now tears welled up in her eyes again. Leela fell silent, stood up, went to the sink and splashed cold water on her face. She took a towel from the drawer, dried herself off, and sat down again. She looked at Charlie, who was silently listening to her, and continued. Instead of going to management and reporting him, I started thinking about agreeing. But the thoughts were not what you might expect. There was no excitement or anticipation of intimacy with another man. It didn't even occur to me. I only thought about work and promotion. And for this, I am so ashamed. After all, this was nothing more than greed on my part. Greed and selfishness. I sold myself for money. It was terrible, Charlie. Worse than I could have imagined. He was disgusting, smug, took advantage of my weakness, my doubts, and made me do something that I will regret for the rest of my life. Charlie wasn't as stunned as Leela might have thought. He understood her desire for approval at work and knew how much it meant to her. Slowly, he began to understand exactly what she was trying to tell him, and he appreciated her attempt. He watched her to see if she was finished. There's something else I need to tell you. This might make you change your mind, and I wouldn't be surprised if it ends our marriage, but I have to be honest and tell you now, while I still have the courage. There should be no more secrets between us. One of the reasons why it was so easy for me to decide to sleep with Carson Jennings for a promotion is because it wasn't the first time I cheated on you. The only other time was 5 years ago, and it only happened once. It was with Jake Monroe, a guy I dated in high school who was the first man in my life. I met him after a meeting with clients. Then I made a good deal and was in seventh heaven. Jake and I started talking. I drank more than I realized and ended up in his room. It was terrible, and after everything I felt bad. You probably remember that I took a few days off and you thought I had the stomach flu. But it was not a disease, it was guilt. That was the only time in our entire marriage, before Carson, that I cheated on you, Charlie, and it was wrong. I never told you because I didn't want to hurt you. But the worst part is that since you didn't know and weren't hurt, I thought I could do it again, and we'd both benefit from the money and the promotion. Now I understand how wrong it was, and I am so ashamed. But Charlie, you have to understand, it was never about you. You have always been more than enough for me. Both times I cheated meant nothing. You are my only love and the only man with whom I have made love. You are all I need. Leela lowered her head and waited for Charlie's answer. She gave him everything she could. The first time and this time were both unnecessary times, and she doubted whether Charlie would ever be able to forgive her. She couldn't forgive herself, so why should he? After Leela finished, he was too confused to process most of what he had heard. It was obvious that she was trying to convince him that sex with Carson Jennings was exactly what she said. She wanted him to understand this and realize that everything was happening solely for the sake of work and not for the sake of satisfaction outside of marriage. He appreciated her desire to explain herself, her logic, and, as was typical of Charlie, he accepted everything as she stated it. Why she felt entitled to do so in the first place was beyond his ability to understand, as well as her previous relationship with her high school sweetheart. Charlie sat without looking at Leela. He tried to decide what to say or do, but could not find an answer. It was all too complicated. He had the advice of his father and mother, the advice of his friend Walt, and the assurances of his girlfriend for the night, whose name he couldn't remember, that he was quite capable of satisfying a woman in bed. Besides, he knew that he himself had cheated on Leela. It couldn't get out of his mind from the moment it happened. But he didn't feel like he now had a get-out-of-jail-free card, just because Leela was unfaithful too. If her loyalty was so important to him, then why couldn't his loyalty be just as important to her? The only thought that kept popping up again and again in Charlie's orderly and disciplined mind was that Leela had cheated twice during their marriage, and he had only cheated once. This imbalance had to be corrected if Charlie wanted to sort things out and reach reconciliation, and he wanted reconciliation. He understood this for sure. He returned home partly because he wanted to be with Leela, even if he couldn't have her as a woman. But after her action today, this issue was resolved. $250,000 and the loss of a job was a very compelling argument, and Charlie always appreciated strong arguments. Charlie made his decision. Right or wrong, he was going to move forward and take risks. He stood up and waited for Leela to look up at him before speaking. I accept your words and the evidence you gave me. I believe you when you say that I was enough for you in bed. The money will go toward Christine's college education. I don't want anything to do with them, knowing where they come from. But it is honest money, and it has cost you dearly, so let it serve her well, and thus get rid of its stain. Thank you, Charlie. I really wanted you to understand that you were never the reason for what I did. It was my fault and mine alone. I never stopped loving you and wanting you. My guilt is my punishment. Only you know how painful it can be. You know me best. Right. But I need to do something, and I think once I do that, we can decide how to move forward and whether we can get back to our lives. We will have to change a lot. We will have to face the truth, but it is possible. And you have to make decisions about your life. I want you to think about this while I'm gone. Are you okay with this? Of course, that suits me. Whatever you say, Charlie, anything, just say it. I'll tell you, but first I want you to think. Think about what you did and why you did it. If you don't understand this, you won't have a chance to avoid repetition. You will definitely do it again when the conditions are right. Never. No, Charlie, I'll never do that again. I already told you that your promises are worthless. You broke your oath twice after swearing allegiance to me. Infidelity to everyone else, Layla, so please do what I ask. When I get back, I want to hear from you why this happened. Do you understand me? Struck by the anger in his words, Leela straightened up and looked him straight in the eyes. Yes, I understand. Where are you going? It's better for you not to know this. I'll be back, but I don't know exactly when. Charlie returned to the very bar where he once discovered one important truth. Now he needed something completely different, and he intended to enjoy it to the fullest. He parked, entered the bar, and looked around. To his pleasant surprise, he saw her. She was sitting at the counter alone. She noticed him, and her face lit up with a wide smile. "Charlie, I'm so glad to see you. Will you buy me a drink? I'll buy it if you tell me your name. Last time I forgot to ask." "My name is..." She looked around, her sweet face taking on a concentrated expression. Then she leaned towards him, pressed her lips to his ear, and whispered, "My real name is Patty. Nobody knows this but you, Charlie. Please don't tell anyone. To everyone else, I'm Sky." "Okay, Sky, do you want to come with me? I'll rent a room where we can talk and then have fun. Is that okay with you? I'll pay whatever you say for a few hours." "I told you, Charlie, free for you." Charlie, no longer timid and shy, no longer average as he used to think of himself, left with Patty. Leela watched Charlie leave and thought how lucky she was that he decided to come home and try to move on. She wasn't stupid enough to believe that he had forgiven her, but she was still happy. Her Charlie was returning. Leela walked up the stairs to the bedroom, where she shed her clothes and went into the shower. She intended to clean herself up, become beautiful for her husband, and try to seduce him, returning him to their bed. It was a strange position she found herself in. Men have always desired her. Her husband had always loved her body and the way it made him feel. She knew he noticed when other men looked at her. She also noticed this and was happy because Charlie knew that she belonged only to him and no one else. At least that's what he thought. And some time ago he began to doubt it. Most of the time she felt confident and secure around Charlie, knowing that he wanted her and that she could always count on him. But not now. Charlie rejected her attempts to get closer and lived next to her for almost a month without touching her even once. Her confidence was shaken and her belief in control over her husband was destroyed. Destroyed by her own stupidity. As Leela dried herself off, applied the powder he liked, and put a drop of perfume between her breasts and behind her ear, she wondered if she could bring him back. Just the thought that she might not be able to make her shiver from the cold and feel weak in her legs. She grabbed the edge of the tabletop to steady herself until she regained control. After she finished applying her lipstick, she walked over to the bed and sat down, trying to find answers to Charlie's questions. She was confused about her feelings for Jake Monroe. Carson Jennings was more understandable to her, but no less disturbing. As she reflected on what had happened, she realized that in both cases she had only thought about Charlie briefly. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became that Charlie wasn't part of her thinking at all. With Jake, her inhibitions were loosened by the alcohol, but even sitting at the table with him, talking to him, and eventually going up to his room, she never thought about Charlie. She had to think of him while sitting at the bar because she was Charlie's wife, and a wife shouldn't sit at a bar and drink with another man. But she remembered this only later, when everything had already happened, and then the feeling of guilt came. Only later. With Carson, she thought even less about Charlie. She brushed him off easily, telling herself that he would never know, as if it mattered, and the feeling of guilt came again only later. In both cases, Charlie was not an obstacle. He was just a consequence. And suddenly it dawned on her. Her problem was that Charlie was too calm, too quiet, too reserved, and she simply pushed him aside when she made decisions. She simply ignored him, as if he was not part of her life, as if he was not part of these decisions. Just like he did tonight when he decided to do something. He didn't consult her, didn't ask her opinion, didn't even tell her about his decision. He left because she made herself unimportant to him. As soon as this thought took shape in her mind, she wondered, where is Charlie now? Is it possible that he is with another woman? Could he do to her what she did to him? The thought made her shiver and a wave of nausea rise in her stomach. God, did she really push him to do to her the same way she did to him? She rushed to the bathroom, this time to get rid of the pain caused by her own thoughts. She suddenly realized that this was exactly how Charlie must have felt when he followed her to the motel and saw her enter the room with Carson. It was too much, too hard. Hours later, she was still sitting on the edge of the bed, waiting for her husband to return. Leela no longer felt confident in his love. She was no longer that strong, confident woman who knew that men wanted her and that her husband wanted her. She was no longer the same woman she had been a month ago. Now she was afraid that her husband, the person she truly loved, no longer loved her. Almost in the morning, Leela finally went to bed alone, as in recent weeks. Charlie never came home that night, and her last thought before going to bed was she going to have to sleep alone forever? The next day, returning late in the morning, Charlie suggested they sit down and talk, and they did so. There was a clear difference between them. Charlie was calm, very collected, ready to listen and think about everything Leela said. He said almost nothing, but asked a lot. He listened to the conclusions she had reached over the past night and agreed with them. In his usual manner, he suggested ways to correct this flaw in his character. Leela listened and agreed, although fear welled up inside her as she realized that his trust in her was no longer unconditional. Leela had no room for bargaining. It was her fault, and Charlie wasn't as lenient as she expected. A new strength appeared in him and even some self-confidence, which she did not like too much. But as they talked, she realized that the new Charlie was much stronger and more confident than before. She had to get used to it, knowing that her actions caused these changes. She didn't love him any less. She might even have gained a new respect for him, the respect that Charlie now demanded. Soon after they reached a new agreement, Charlie returned to her bed and they made love again. Leela missed him so much that she was ready to do anything he wanted. He had new desires, but none of them caused her rejection. As she took a pose for one of the new practices that Charlie liked, a thought flashed through her. Where did he learn this? But the thought immediately disappeared when Charlie entered her. The only thing she felt was how good it was to be filled with him again. Leela found a new job, but only worked there for a year before she became pregnant with their second daughter. Charlie suggested calling her Patricia Patty for short. Leela was surprised and asked where he got the name, but Charlie just smiled and said that it was a name from the past, associated with pleasant memories. Leela had her suspicions, but she put them aside and agreed with his choice. And again, as she had done for the past year, she wondered where Charlie had gone that night. He just smiled back, just like when she asked about Patty's name. End. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.